To a casual observer, Warhammer 40,000 might seem incredibly complicated and not worth checking out because it seems so hard to get into. Well, we are here to dispel those myths, because I'm Matt with Bowles, and today we are going to be going over all of the basics you'll need to know to get started playing Warhammer 40,000 in just under 17 minutes. If you're brand new to Warhammer, welcome, we're happy to see you. We are Bell of Lost Souls, and we cover everything Warhammer, but also everything else tabletop. So be sure to subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest. Now, if you're curious about getting into the lore of Warhammer, I encourage you to check out the Warhammer 40,000 LEXICANUM channel. Link for that in the description of this video. But if you're here to learn how to play, let's get to it. One important thing to keep in mind when discussing rules in a game like Warhammer is rule exceptions. Basically, everything I say in the remainder of this video will always have an exception. Warhammer 40,000 is a competitive tabletop wargame. It pits two players head-to-head. Players will move minis around the play area, roll dice to determine the outcome of their attacks, and attempt to score points by performing various actions or meeting certain conditions. Contrary to popular belief, many games don't end with one player's army being completely wiped off the board, although some games do end that way. The game ends at the end of the 5th game round, and whichever player has the most points wins. Each player brings their own custom-built army of miniatures with which to do battle. Some miniatures are single important characters who can run around doing their own thing, while other minis form a group. Both single characters and groups each form what is called a unit. Each unit has its own set of attributes, weapons, war gear, special abilities, and more. These will all be noted on that unit's datasheet. Each unit also costs a certain number of list building points. These points are completely different from victory points, so keep that in mind as we move forward. Before any game of Warhammer 40,000 begins, players must muster their army, or colloquially, build their list. While list building, both players, or whatever tournament they're playing in, will decide how many points to allow for each player's list. The more points, the bigger the army. A small-scale battle being somewhere around 1,000, while a large-scale war is around 3,000, but this is just a guideline. There's so much opinion and theory and arguments over proper list building. It's a topic we won't even be attempting to touch in this video. But be sure to head over to the Bowles main site to read one of our many army guides about each faction. Again, links for that in this video's description. Once both players have set up their list, the game setup can begin. Warhammer 40,000 uses a mission-based gameplay. Each game will start with players determining the mission using mission cards. These cards outline the specific deployment, special mission rule, primary objectives, secondary objectives, and gambit for each player. Although the core rulebook also contains the only war mission, which also outlines all of these details without needing the cards, if you're ready to just jump in and play. But ultimately, how you choose to set up the game is up to you or the tournament you're playing. Most units will be placed in the player's deployment zone during game setup. Players go back and forth deploying units until both players have fully deployed their army. During deployment, players will have the option of leaving some of their units in reserve, but no more than 25% of their total points cost. This means they are not placed on the board during deployment, but can be deployed later during the game at the end of the movement step, as we'll discuss later. Some units will have a special rule, for example, Deep Strike, which will also allow units to be placed in reserve without counting towards the 25% limit. Once both armies have been fully deployed, the game can begin in earnest. As mentioned earlier, each game of Warhammer 40,000 is played over 5 rounds, and each round is broken into 5 phases. These are command, movement, shooting, charge, and fight. So let's go over each of these phases in more detail. 2 things happen in the command phase. Players generate command points, and units take Battleshock tests. At the start of each command phase, both players will gain 1 command point. Command points are used for issuing stratagems, which are pretty important to know when getting into Warhammer, so let's take a quick aside to discuss what they are and how they work. Stratagems are special abilities that can be activated in order to perform special actions, or grant bonuses, or any number of other effects. Each stratagem is packed with information. This icon indicates in which phase that stratagem can be used, and the number below it indicates how many command points it costs to enact. Finally, the text details of the stratagem reiterate when the stratagem can be used, who the stratagem can be used to target, and its effect. Each stratagem can only be used once each phase, so keep that in mind when choosing to implement, for example, the command reroll stratagem, which will certainly be a staple for most games. So that's stratagems. Now, back to the command phase. Also in the command phase is where the loyalty and tenacity of your army is tested. During this phase, each unit that was reduced to half strength is Battleshock tested. In this context, a unit's strength is determined by the number of surviving models, not the strength characteristic as listed on their datasheet, so keep that in mind. So, a unit with 10 models must pass a morale test if they have 4 or fewer models remaining. Remember, it's less than half strength. But also, a unit with a single model, like an important character, can also be affected in this same way. Any unit with a starting strength of 1, meaning a single character, is also considered to be below half strength if their remaining wounds is less than half of their wounds characteristic. So when a character is more than half dead, they might also turn tail and run. When making a morale test for a unit, roll 2d6 and check the result against that unit's leadership stat. If the result on the dice is greater than or equal to the unit's leadership, great, the morale was tested and they passed with flying colors. However, if the result is less than that unit's leadership score, their loyalty is broken and that unit is battle-shocked. While a unit is battle-shocked, they have an objective control characteristic of 0, meaning they won't be holding on to any objectives to score points. Their controlling player also cannot use any stratagems to affect that unit, and if the unit falls back, they must first take a desperate escape test, which we'll get to in the movement phase. After all units under half strength have been tested, the remaining stalwart units now move into the movement phase. In your movement phase, each one of your units can move each model in that unit a number of inches up to its movement characteristic, as listed under the M on its datasheet. And when moving a unit, it's important to keep in mind the idea of unit coherency. Units with multiple models can't scatter out on their own, and they must remain within 2 inches of each other member of that unit. However, a unit with only a single character doesn't have to worry about coherency as they're off on their own. Any unit which starts its movement phase in close quarters combat, which the rulebook calls in engagement range, won't be able to move so freely. They will only be able to remain stationary or fall back. Any unit that remains stationary can gain some additional bonuses or options depending on their weapons and war gear and other abilities, especially with regard to some specific weapons. Rather than simply being able to use the move action to leave hand-to-hand combat, units must take the fall back move in order to escape an engagement range of an enemy. Doing so means that that unit will not be able to shoot nor declare a charge for the remainder of the turn. And remember, any units that are battle-shocked must first make a desperate escape test before using fallback. When making a desperate escape test on a fallback, the player rolls a d6 for each model in that unit, and for every 1 or 2 rolled, 1 model of the controlling player's choice is slain. So it might be worth just leaving them in combat, but that's up for you to decide. Units can also do an advance move. Any unit that opts to advance rolls a d6 and adds the result to their movement stat for that turn, letting them move even further. Any unit that advances also cannot shoot or charge for the remainder of the turn, so use sparingly. As we mentioned earlier, some armies will have units start the game in reserve to be deployed at some later point. The end of the movement phase is that later point in time. Any reinforcement units deployed in this way are considered to have made a normal move and can act otherwise normally for the remainder of the turn. Once all units have either moved or declared their remaining stationary, play moves into the shooting phase. While plenty of units in Warhammer 40,000 don't have any ranged weapons, most of them do, and a large chunk of the game is decided during the shooting phase. During the shooting phase, the active player chooses which unit they will shoot with, performs all of their shooting, then fires with their next unit, and then the next, and the next, until they have shot with every unit in their army that they want to shoot with. In order to shoot a target, the firing unit and the target cannot be in engagement range of an enemy, must be in range of their target, and must be able to see their target. While there are a wide variety of weapons in Warhammer 40,000, the process for shooting them is always the same. Rather than using the stats of the unit holding the weapon, the player pulls up the stats for the weapon being fired and uses that to determine how the attack plays out. So let's run through a typical shooting phase with these Space Marine Terminators with Storm Bolters and one Assault Cannon firing on these Tyranid Termagants. Each model in the unit makes a number of attacks equal to the attack stat of the weapon they're holding. They roll that many dice and check the individual rolls against the weapon's ballistic skill, or BS. For each die roll equal to or greater than the weapon's ballistic skill, that model has landed a hit, and all the other dice are discarded for now. There are a lot of factors which can modify a 2-hit roll, but it can never be modified by more than +1 or -1. Additionally, an unmodified roll of 1 always misses, and an unmodified roll of 6 not only always hits, but is also considered a critical hit, which can trigger other effects for some weapons and other abilities. Each successful hit roll is then used to determine if the weapon successfully wounded the target. Each of the dice that landed a hit on their target are rolled again, and now the strength of the weapon is compared to the toughness of the target. How these two values compare determines what value is required to wound that target with that weapon. If the strength of the weapon and the toughness of the target are equal, then any wound roll of 4 or more successfully wounds that target. If the weapon is a little stronger than the target, it's easier to wound them, so it only needs a 3+ to wound that target. And if the weapon is twice as strong as the target, then you only need a 2+ to wound. It sounds a little complicated at first, but once it clicks, you won't even be thinking about it anymore and it'll just come naturally. I promise. Wound rolls, like hit rolls, can never be modified by more than +or -1. An unmodified wound roll of 1 never wounds, and an unmodified wound roll of 6 always wounds and is also a critical wound, which again can trigger certain abilities. For each successful wound roll, the defending player allocates these wounds to whichever models they choose in the defending unit. However, before damage is dealt, the defending unit can attempt to make a saving throw against the incoming attack, having the shot bounce off their armor. The defending player makes a saving throw roll for each incoming wound and modifies the die result by the armor penetration of the incoming weapon, which is listed under the AP heading on the weapon stat card. Similar to before, a saving throw can never be improved by more than +1, but thanks to armor penetration, will very often be reduced by much more than -1. As with all of the rolls before, a saving throw of 1 always fails. However, an important note of distinction is that an unmodified saving roll of 6 has no guarantee of success. So rolling a 6 on a saving throw can still fail if enough armor penetration is applied from the weapon. Many units also have something called an Invulnerable Save, which functions the exact same way as a saving throw, however, it is not affected by a weapon's armor penetration. If a unit has a saving throw and an Invulnerable Save, the defending player chooses which to use before any saves are rolled. For each saving throw which meets or exceeds the defending unit's saving throw stat, that model makes the save and takes no damage. Otherwise, that model takes as much damage as listed under the attacking weapon's damage stat, or D. For each damage applied to a model, it loses 1 wound from its wound stat, and when a model's wounds is reduced to 0, they are killed and removed from play. Once the shooting phase is done, we can move into the charge phase. The charge phase gives units a chance to get into melee range with their enemy. The active player chooses one of their units that didn't advance or fall back, and is not already in engagement range of another enemy unit, and also is not a plane. The active player chooses which of their units they want to charge with, and then chooses a target within 12 inches of that unit. Then they roll 2d6 to determine how many inches that unit can charge this phase. If the amount rolled is enough to reach their target, then that unit does so and can move into base-to-base contact with their target in order to punch, claw, slice, or stab as much as they see fit. That unit is now in engagement range of that enemy. Once all units who can and chose to charge have done so or attempted to do so, then they can start fighting. The fight phase is a lot like the shooting phase, but for fists instead of bullets. Unlike in the shooting phase, during the fight phase, both players will get to act, alternating back and forth, choosing which units to fight with. Each fight begins with the unit starting a pile-in move. This allows each model in the unit to move up to 3 inches in order to get as close to as many enemy models as possible. In fact, they must if they can. Once a unit has piled in, they start making their attacks. The process for making a melee attack during the fight phase is essentially exactly the same as making a shooting attack during the shooting phase. So jump back to that chapter if you need a quick refresher. But here, the dice are compared to the weapon's weapon skill as opposed to their ballistic skill. Like I said, basically the same with only the slight modification of weapon skill versus ballistic skill. After a unit has made all of their attacks, they make a Consolidate move. They move up to 3 inches to smoosh into the enemy after potentially killing off a few of their individuals. After that's done, the other player chooses one of their units to fight with, and the process repeats, at which point the first player will choose one of their units to fight with, and so on back and forth until everyone has fought. Once each unit from both players has fought, that player's turn is over, and then the other player will take their turn. Once the second player has completed their turn, that ends the game round. And then after 5 game rounds, the game's over and players tally up the victory points they scored from scoring objectives and whatever else from the mission, and then whoever has more points wins. There are plenty of other rules you'll need to know to truly master a game like Warhammer 40,000, things like psychic abilities and weapons, unit keywords, terrain features, cover, flying units, and a ton more. If this video was all useful, please drop us a like, it really does help a lot. 10th edition 40k has done a great job of slimming down the core rules that you'll need to know in order to get your feet wet in the grim dark world of Warhammer. If you're just getting started in Warhammer, you might want to check out the Leviathan box. It's going to have everything you'll need to get started playing Warhammer 10th edition. You can check out our unboxing video of that right here. Again, I am Matt with Bowls. Thanks for watching. Bye.